Vale. Bueno, pues buenas tardes a todos, a todas. Muchas gracias por aceptar la invitación a participar de este conversatorio, Historia, identidades y racismo en Estados Unidos y Colombia. Hoy tenemos el gusto de tener al profesor Alexander Weheliye con nosotros, profesor de estudios afroamericanos en la Universidad de Northwestern, académico en temas de literatura y cultura negra, teoría crítica, tecnologías sociales y cultura popular. Muchas gracias, profesor Alexander, por estar aquí. Bienvenido.
Okay, so
thank you. I understood.
Yeah. Okay, great, awesome.
Vale. Y también al profesor Óscar Quintero, profesor asistente del Departamento de Sociología de la Universidad Nacional de Colombia, doctor en Sociología y magíster en Geografía, que también nos acompaña en el día de hoy. Igualmente, profesor Óscar Quintero, mil gracias por estar con nosotras y bienvenido.
Hola, mucho gusto. Nice to meet you, Alexander.
Vale. Bien.
Nice to meet you too.
Estamos la profesora Beatriz Guerrero y quien les habla, Rosemilia Bermúdez, quien vamos a facilitar también las preguntas, la moderación y en algún momento también participar con ustedes en la conversación. Y le damos también la bienvenida a las otras personas que nos acompañan, a la profesora Luz Baloyes Chávez, a Estefanía Arias, por supuesto a Ana María Mosquera, quien va a apoyarnos en la traducción, en algunos cuando sea necesario, y también a Candy Luanar Correa, también vinculada al proyecto. Bueno, en la tarde de hoy, en esa hora y 15, hora y 30 que vamos a compartir, queremos invitarlos a presentarse, digamos, desde sus trayectorias académicas y establecer una conversación amigable, fluida, empática entre quienes estamos aquí, principalmente pues entre los profes panelistas. Vamos a ver si la profesora Anny Ocoró se alcanza a conectar, quien también estaba invitada a participar como panelista, pero tuvo una dificultad en la recogida de su hijita. Vamos a comenzar con una presentación de cada uno de los dos profesores que los invitamos a hacerla de la manera más tranquila y amigable posible en términos de presentarnos su trayectoria académica.
So the idea right now is that professors that are in charge of sharing their experiences today, we want to start with an introduction of all of you. And this introduction can be like friendly, sharing who are you, a little bit of your academic trajectory, your academic career, what you focus on, and that will be it. So we're going to start with the introductions.
Bueno, entonces, ¿quién quisiera comenzar? Profesor Óscar Quintero, si usted quiere conversar para entrar un poco en confianza, adelante.
Bueno, está bien. Bueno, buenas tardes. Mucho gusto. Bueno, sí, soy Óscar Quintero. Soy sociólogo, egresado de la Universidad Nacional de Colombia. Y bueno, digamos que mi trayectoria en estos temas ha sido bastante particular. Bueno, tuve la oportunidad de, siendo estudiante de licenciatura, conocer varios proyectos de investigación sobre poblaciones afrocolombianas en Colombia, principalmente un gran proyecto de investigación que se desarrolló digamos como en la segunda parte de los años 90, en donde participaba un grupo muy grande de profesores de la Universidad del Valle con investigadores de Francia. Si quieres, dejo ahí a Ana María para que puedas.
Yeah. So, he says, hi, it's a pleasure to be here. Nice to meet you. Oscar is a graduate from the Universidad Nacional, and he has a teaching degree And in this teaching degree, he has been able to work with different projects, with the different Afro-Colombian, African descendant communities. And he worked on a really big research project on the second last half of the 90s with a group that was conformed by different professors from Universidad del Valle, which is our university, and professors from France.
Ok, y bueno, después, vemos que a partir de eso, bueno, tuve como, en estos momentos, estoy hablando como inicios de los 2000, estaba muy en boga, creo que el estudio del movimiento social afrocolombiano, justamente porque una década antes, pues habíamos tenido la reforma constitucional, ¿no? La ley 70, bueno, en fin, todas estas reformas también legislativas. Y pues ahí desarrollé mi tesis de maestría sobre el movimiento social afrocolombiano, específicamente en Bogotá, pues porque digamos que hasta ese momento el movimiento que se conoce como el movimiento afro había estado considerado, pues digamos, muy estudiado en el Pacífico colombiano, ¿no? Y sobre todo en las zonas rurales del Pacífico colombiano. Entonces, digamos que esa era como una entrada también de investigación que se empezaba a abrir y era justamente pues estudiar esta movilización, pero en un contexto urbano y también en un contexto urbano que no necesariamente, digamos, simbólicamente se considerara como un territorio negro en Colombia, como es el caso de Bogotá, ¿no?
So from this research group he worked on in the early 2000s, he was studying the social movement of Afro-Colombians, so the Afro-Colombian social movement, especially taking into account that a decade before we had different reforms, different laws, one of them being the Law 70, that's how we call it, Law 70. So he, a decade after, is working on the whole social movement of Afro-Colombians, and this is part of his master's research project, which was the social movement of Afro-Colombians in Bogota. So Bogota is the capital city, and he studied how the Pacific Coast and the people that come from the Pacific Coast, from the rural areas of the Pacific Coast in Colombia, are having a social movement in the city and having a more urban experience and let's say we call like a mobilization or like a protest social movement in the city, in a city that is not necessarily a Black territory.
Ok, y bueno, y a partir de, digamos, como de esta investigación, bueno, digamos que identificaba como una de las causas para la movilización era justamente la experiencia del racismo, ¿no? Digamos que creo que eso es interesante porque, es decir, creo que los estudios en Colombia se habían hasta ese momento, y creo que aún hoy en día se mantiene, digamos, como en el registro del estudio de las identidades. Entonces, al identificar yo esa causa para la movilización, pues digamos que me hice fue como la pregunta de pues, qué significa experimentar el racismo en una sociedad como la colombiana, en donde pues además había todo una, ¿cómo decirlo? O celebración del multiculturalismo, ¿no? de Estado. Entonces, pues ahí entablé, yo hice mis estudios en Francia, de maestría en Francia, y de doctorado seguí, pero digamos que cambié ahí radicalmente la perspectiva de estudio para analizar más este asunto del racismo, muy centrado en, digamos, como la experiencia vivida de racismo por estudiantes universitarios. Y pues ahí también además empecé a desarrollar un estudio comparado entre Francia y Colombia, bueno, Bogotá, París, bueno, inspirado también por unos trabajos de Filomena S., que es una de las autores que ha acuñado esta noción de everyday racism. Entonces, bueno, básicamente ese ha sido como el punto también de llegada de mis estudios sobre el racismo en Colombia.
Vale, vale, muchas gracias, Óscar. Ya le voy a dar lugar a Ana María la traducción y para que cuando termine la traducción, Ana María, introduzcas al profesor Alexander para que nos comience su propia presentación.
Okay, so from that research project about social movements, he identified that one of the causes for this social movement was the experience of racism. And he found that interesting because this experience of racism was also based on the identities and identities studies. So he started to question and exploring the question what it is to experience racism in a country like Colombia, where there is a celebration of multiculturalism, yes, and multiculturals. We are a multicultural country. So he did his master's in France, and in that master's program, he changed the perspective of racism, and he centered his studies on the racism against university students, and then did a compared research studies between Bogota and Paris. Inspired also in the author, if I'm not mistaken, Filomena Essence that you mentioned. So that would be basically the whole like center of his studies. So now the idea is that you can continue with your introduction, Dr. Alexander, and I'm going to also like, translate and share whatever you share with us, okay, in Spanish.
Okay. Ana María y Rosa, qué pena, antes de que el profesor siga, no sé, pues yo entiendo el inglés, no sé si la traducción al español sea también necesaria, pues el resto de personas.
Okay.
Inclusive no estaba preparado para el inglés, pero igual también creo que puedo.
¿La escucha? Sí.
Sí, ok.
Para mí está
Y
perfecto.
más bien, si Ana María, si necesitamos algo en particular, le preguntamos a Ana María.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Vale.
I'm not gonna do the translation in Spanish, but if there's like a specific question about what you share with us, I'll translate it. But we're all understanding.
Okay. Okay. So just to be clear in terms of the structure, this is basically what was in the schedule as like the 10 minutes of presenting your research on race and racism. Am I understanding that correctly? Okay. I just wanted to make sure.
Yes. Right.
Yeah, so, you know, my work is a little bit different because I'm not a social scientist. Really, if I would have to sort of sum up like what is at the heart of my work is to really kind of understand not only Black people and Black culture, but the idea of Blackness, both in a kind of philosophical sense, but also in a sense that, you know, there can be Blackness without the presence of Black people. Like, how does that structure the world that we live in, right? That's kind of my guiding question. I don't know if that's too abstract. I'll try to sort of give some more examples. And I think that, you know, we talked about this a little bit last time in our conversation, that I think, you know, I mean, I don't think autobiography is everything, but I do think it's important in terms of like how I'm situated. And I do think that for me, this kind of broader idea of Blackness and thinking about Blackness, not something that's specific to Colombia or the United States, but that works globally, right, comes from my experience of having lived in different parts of the world, having lived on the African continent, having when I was growing up. And yeah, so I think that that is kind of the broader thing. And more specifically in terms of my own research, my first book, which came out in 2005, was about the relationship between Black culture, music, and technology. And again, I think that also has had something to do with my own experiences. Having not grown up in the United States, the way that I experienced Black music, right, particularly from the United States, was usually not in the form of live concerts, but it was on the radio, on television, and in clubs, right? So it was technologically mediated. And the kind of question that I was trying to answer there was like, what happens when we think about the relationship between Black culture and technology and music? Like, what kind of different idea about Black culture does that give us? Because there's this kind of longstanding idea that Black culture and technology don't go together, right? But if, of course, you look at the history of music, that's completely untrue, where Black culture, whether it's in the United States or in the Caribbean or in the African continent, has really driven technological information, right? Or technological innovation, I'm sorry. So for instance, you know, this idea at some point in hip hop music that you could use the turntable as an instrument completely redefined what the turntable used to be, right? And there are a number of other examples such as that. Shall I take a little bit of a breather, or shall I continue?
Yes, maybe we can give that space. ¿Alguna pregunta o duda está ahí?
Óscar, ¿no?
I think you can continue. It's very interesting.
So, I mean, one of the things, for instance, that I looked at in the book that kind of maybe sort of speaks somewhat directly to some of the questions that you all are interested in. The last chapter of the book looked at some different examples of hip hop groups, right? One hip hop group that was Haitian American, then there was a Black German group and a Black British group. And I was trying to understand how Black people, particularly outside of the United States, participate in Black culture as a kind of form of citizenship, right? What I called in that context diasporic citizenship. That is really, really different from the way that we think about traditionally citizenship, right? And of course, you know, we have a lot of studies, including Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic, that talk about how the very idea of citizenship and the nation is something that has been only violent to Black people, like historically speaking, right? So I was trying to think about what are some of the alternatives that Black people participate in, these alternative public spheres through music videos, et cetera, and so on, right? And I'm sure this is not my area of specialty, but I'm sure one could, you know, make similar cases about the way that certain kinds of Black music are taken up in Colombia or in Brazil, in many different places, right? I happen to sort of, you know, my expertise is North America and Europe, right? But I think, yeah, that was an important thing. And I mean, I think overall, in terms of my engagement with and thinking about Black music, I think it's really important because it's one of the main places where Black people have been able to exert a certain amount of agency, right? Of course, there's also violence involved with the kind of structures of recording industry, et cetera, and so on. But it has to me been the kind of space where Black people have been able to articulate agency and being, right, in ways that have not really been possible in visual art, cinema, and even literature until very recently, and that's one of the reasons that I keep coming back to it, right? And then, you know, my second book, which appeared in 2014, Habeas Viscus, I kind of wanted to move away from the music and the sound aspect to kind of draw attention to sort of different aspects of this idea of what does Blackness mean for modernity? What does it mean for modern life? because one of the things that I felt like in the way that people responded to phonographies is that they could sort of like push it away in a certain way and say, oh, you know, you're writing about Black music and that's something that's specific, right? Whereas my point is that when we talk about Black music and we talk about technology, this is something that has bearings on so many different aspects of what we call modern modern life, right? And that, you know, if you go back historically, for instance, the history of the recording industry in the United States has, from its very initial moment, always been about exploiting Black music, right? It happened with jazz and the blues in the 1920s. It happened with soul in the 1960s. It happened with rock and roll in the 1950s, right? And it continues to happen now. I don't know if anybody has heard about this. There was a case this week in the United States where a record company, a large record company, signed a rapper that was not an actual person, but an artificial intelligence. And he was the rapper, and they signed him, and he made a music video. You can kind of imagine where the story is going to go. Of course, him being a rapper, he performed in a certain kind of way, right? It wasn't quite clear. He wasn't white, the rapper, right? This artificial intelligence, but he was also not clearly Black. But he used the N-word over and over again. So people protested and said, and of course, the creators of this artificial intelligence were two white dudes, right? Two white men. And you kind of see that, that's the kind of extreme sort of version of it. You see that over and over, over and over again, that's kind of what the recording industry, its main thing is to kind of exploit Black people and Black music. So yeah, so I wanted to draw attention to different aspects of it. And I also really wanted in that text to kind of highlight the significance of Black feminism. So I kind of staged a conversation between the very influential work of Giorgio Agamben and Michel Foucault, who both are European theorists, white European theorists, writing about racism, right? And I remember, you know, for instance, when there's this Foucault volume of lectures, I think This Society Must Be Defended, when it first came out, I felt like especially a lot of white scholars were happy that Foucault is finally talking about racism, right? Where there was this idea, oh, we can go to Foucault now, who's this expert, right? Because he's a white European man, and we don't have to deal with, you know, people thinking about Blackness and racism from the United States, from Latin America, from the African continent, right? So, I mean, what I do in that book, or what I set out to do, was to really show how both Giorgio Agamben and his idea of homo sacer and Foucault's idea of biopolitics, even though they write about racism, that they really do not actually think about the question of race and Blackness, right? And there are also, you know, more historical moments, for instance, with Foucault, who was very involved in the anti-prison activism in France in the 1960s, and helped translate the works of the Black Panthers from the United States, from the Black Panther Party. But that work was never reflected in his actual writing, right? Where it was very clear that he'd gotten certain ideas from Angela Davis and George Jackson, right? And then on the other hand, what I did was to look at, you know, an example of two Black feminist theorists, Sylvia Wynter from Jamaica and Hortense Spillers from the United States, and highlighted how they have much, much more robust theories of race, Blackness, and racism, also theories of race and racism that does not ignore gender and sexuality, right? So there are, you know, few more arguments there, but I think that's the kind of, that was the larger point, and still thinking about how Blackness and Black culture sort of structures modern life. And yeah, and it's not really a book that I would write in this way anymore. I felt like I needed to do it. I've called it in some cases an exorcism, where I sort of felt like the kind of white Western European theory, like it needed to just be sort of dismantled. And I think, again, to come back to the autobiographical thing, a lot of what appears in the writings of Foucault and Agamben, I mean, also appears in a lot of other white European theorists, where there's this resistance to thinking about race and racism, right? Or race more rather than racism. And it also really mirrored my experiences of growing in Germany, right? Where one could never talk about racism or Blackness because that made you the racist, right? Whereas, you know, to go back to what you were just saying, there was this kind of surface level conversation about multiculturalism, right? That was acceptable, but like talking about race and it's still not, right? At least in the German in the German context, and yeah. So so there's that, and then in terms of my current work, I just finished a book which is about music. It's about R&B music, and it's about particularly Black women, Black queer people singing voices in relationship to technology. And it follows a couple of these ideas that I've developed in other in other parts. And then the other project that I've also been working on is, I would say, an extension of Habeas Viscus. And it looks at different literary texts, but also music and film, in order to think about how Blackness operates in this kind of what I'm calling philosophically ontological sphere, right? Again, in a way that is very, very much tied to questions of gender and sexuality, and it very much continues, you know, my engagement, especially with Hortense Spiller's work and her ideas of flesh and ungendering, right? It kind of takes that as a starting as a starting point. And the way that I'm thinking about it now is that I want it to be a alternate periodic system, right? Or periodic table that has the different elements of Black life, right? And to kind of play with that idea of the periodic system. And what I really hope in the end will happen structurally with the text is that I would like to collaborate with the visual artist who designs the periodic table, the alternate periodic table, and the different entries, and also a poet who then writes, you know, poetic entries for the different the different entries. And I think that's kind of where my work has been going in the last few years, that I'm interested more in collaboration, and B, in collaboration particularly with people who are artists, right? Whether these are visual artists or musicians, etc., and so on. And I think that this is also something that's part of my teaching, where I usually bring people in, local people from Chicago, visual artists, filmmakers, musicians into my classes. And yeah, and I think that that's become increasingly important to me, to kind of be able to think about these questions not only in a strictly sort of academic scholarly sense, but to kind of open it up, right, in terms of having different voices, different voices present. So yeah, so we'll see where that goes. Yeah, I think that's about it. I'm happy to answer any questions. I hope that was clear.
Mm-hmm. No sé si Óscar quisiera reaccionar de alguna manera, establecer alguna pregunta o ampliación que quisieras tener. Bueno, la idea es conversemos, o sea, que sí, conversen entre
Okay, well, I don't know, it's very interesting. It's much more the point of view of music, because I was thinking about racism and music here in Colombia, because music can be a way of empowerment of Black people, etc., but also a reproduction of stereotypes, racism, and I think that there is a very interesting point of view. Why not? Maybe I take the second question about the themes that could be very interesting in order to work together. Because, well, I think that racism could be studied as a discourse or as a practice, no? But I think that there is one thing that's very interesting is to know how racism is updating, always updating. I think we saw that here in Colombia with the last presidential run. That in the last speech the project did 2 weeks ago. It's very interesting because racism is not always the same, but it has always some core aspects in order to produce itself. So I think that music it could be very interesting. We have a lot of experiences here with some groups, Chop It Down, that at the beginning had a very how do you say, underground purpose, critical purpose, etc., and then all the music industry took them and I don't know, co-opted. I don't know how do you say co-opted, but co-opted. Okay, thank you. So I think that's very interesting. I wonder, for example, because here in Latin America we talk about a lot about salsa music, for example, but I think that the racial issues around salsa are not very well studied. I don't know, because I think that behind salsa there is another kind of Blackness identity, but it's much more produced like a Latin American gender, etc., and the Blackness of salsa, for example, is it's hidden, I think, a little bit. So just like reaction, I could say that. Yes.
No, and I think that definitely happens with the history of salsa, right? That it gets deracinated and becomes sort of like, I don't know, it becomes a kind of like Latin American multicultural thing. The same thing with reggaeton, right? Where, you know, the Black roots are erased, both in terms of the performers who are the most successful now, but also in terms of the history, right? In terms of it having a history in Panama, etc. With Black laborers from Jamaica, right, who have settled there because of the Panama Canal. So I think, yeah, it happens in a lot of in a lot of different places, and even in the United States with hip hop, you know, that what I was talking about, that example, right? It seems ridiculous, but it's one example in, you know, the history of many, where there is this kind of attempt from the recording industry, A, to kind of de-radicalize hip hop, and B, to make it something that is not specifically Black, right? Because then, you know, that is more financially valuable. And yeah, and I think also the other thing that tends to happen with Black music, especially when it is not in, you know, a place like the United States, that it is appreciated in the sense that it like is folkloric, right? That it has something traditional to it, but the kind of newer aspects of it are usually not appreciated as much because they're usually performed by poor people, right? To put it like in very stark, very stark terms. So they have to kind of be transformed into something, into something else in order to be recognized as art, right? If that makes if that makes sense. So yeah. So for me, you know, music is music, but it's also, especially since I'm not a musicologist or even an ethnomusicologist, but it's a kind of window into a lot of different places, right? That sort of allows me to kind of think about how Blackness operates in these different in these different sites, right? So yeah, and you know, I don't know that much about the history of Black music in Colombia besides, you know, knowing that it exists. So I would be interested to hear what you all have there. But I'm also happy to talk about something something else. And I also, another thing that I wanted to say, I had a few years ago a student who did a research project, a really interesting one, about, this was at the height of the Black Lives Matter protests. And she did a research project on chant. Chant, I don't know what that would be in Spanish, like chanting, you know. Anybody? Chant. C-H-A-N-T.
Cantos.
Something like, yeah, that you, it's like a kind of rhythmic speech, right? Of course, I can't remember any of the chants myself now, but you know, there are these chants, and people would also sing at the protests, right? So she did this interesting research project about how music and sound is, you know, and of course, you know, you can go back to the 1960s in the United States and how, you know, people were, Black activists were using particularly church music in order to do that. But yeah, that the sound aspect and the musical aspect is something that is part and parcel of protest culture, especially for Black people in the United States. And I know here in Chicago, for instance, that oftentimes at protests, people will play house music, right? Because house music, of course, is from Chicago, and people are really invested in that. I don't think that happens in a lot of other places, but it does happen in in Chicago, right? So that would be a question that I would be interested in. Is there something, you know, does this happen in Colombia as well? You know, when you were talking about the protests, if so, what kind of chants are used? Like, are people playing music? Are they dancing? There's also dancing at the protests. So yeah, so it opens up into a lot of different places. Another thing that I think in terms of music, especially when it is played in public, that is really important, is that it usually comes along with policing, right? So that, for instance, if you look at the history of Black music in London, there was a certain moment in the early 2000s where Black British music was perceived to be violent because it was mostly performed by young Black men for young Black men, that they completely changed the nightclub laws. And none of it actually says that they don't want Black artists performing. But if you read the questions, right, it's really clear that this is what is happening, right? So, you know, there's questions like, what is the racial identity of the performer if you want to book a venue? So it's already there as the first question. In the United States, for instance, there are all these clubs for that have very, very strict clothing rules, and almost all of them are anti-Black, right? So, you know, there's always no baggy pants, no sneakers, no fitted hats, no, back in the day, large white t-shirts, et cetera, and so on. All these things that are associated with Black people. And, you know, you can go back in history too, that, you know, there's all these different ways in which, you know, Black music in public, whether it's in clubs or on the street, that it gets policed, right? Because it's perceived to be as something violent and aggressive, right? So yeah, that would be another thing that I would be that I would be interested in thinking about. You know, is this something that happens in Colombia? How does it happen? In what context? What are the similarities and differences?
¿Vale?
Pero Oscar quiere, qué pena, profe, ¿quiere responder a la pregunta?
Sí. Yes, I just wonder if we can, I don't know, what do you think? But if we can talk here in Colombia around a Black culture, or because I don't know. I think we have several Black culture aspects that are related with the general culture, that it could be specific, but I don't know if we have a Black culture with also a Black market, because I think that I don't think that it could be separate, because I don't know. I think that's very interesting because yes, I don't know. And that take us to the works of Peter Wade, maybe the work of Elizabeth Kunal, which is a researcher, a French researcher, and she did a work about champeta gender, which was a very specific, in that sense, Black music in Cartagena, which was a mix of Latin American and African rhythms. It's much more like reggaeton, but it's much more specific, etc. But then,
what is it? Can you say the name again of the genre?
Champeta.
Champeta. Okay.
Champeta.
Yes.
I'm gonna write it there in the chat. Champeta. Yes.
I got it.
Yes. But it was the same story. So champeta was the very specific Black music, popular. No, it was very related with a popular population of Cartagena, etc. And then it was the rhythm was very political, also. I don't know, promise, but then it was like erased little by little, and champeta today is much more like another folklore gender. So I don't know. So I think that, because that's very interesting also, because here in Colombia we have always that tension between ethnical and cultural issues and racial and Black issues. So, and in the end, we don't know what do we have. I think yes, because it's always a mix. It's always a mix. Of course, rap and hip hop is also related with Black people, but also with popular young girls in the cities, etc. So it's not only a Black expression, etc. So I think that question is it's very interesting, because yes, I think we have a lot of work to do. Yes.
And I think it's similar to a certain extent in the United States, right? I mean, I think that hip hop, on the one hand, it's very specifically Black, but on the other hand, it's also the major form of American popular music at this point in time, especially, you know, and if you look at globally as well, that so many different groups, particularly marginalized groups, have taken to it. But I think, you know, it's still also important to kind of highlight the tension that is still there, right? Because I think, you know, whether this is in Colombia, it's in Panama, it's in Puerto Rico, it's usually that Black artists are the innovators, but very rarely are they the ones, right, who are very, very successful, right? Yeah, and that they sort of like, A, don't get like the financial gain, and B, are also tend to get written out of the history at a certain point, right? Yeah, but I think that there are a lot of things definitely there. Can I ask, what is there still, from what you were saying, the protests were a few years ago, right? And the protests were in Bogota primarily. Am I understanding that correctly? Correct me if I'm wrong.
They were not only in Bogota, but also
Okay.
in the west coast of Colombia, in Cali,
Yeah.
and it was a very interesting thing because it was not only Afro-Colombian mobilization, but also the indigenous people were also involved. So, but I think that renewed the racial question here in Colombia.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, because also elites renew their discourse, the racial discourse against Black people and the indigenous people.
Indigenous people. And was it related or, you know, in dialogue with what was happening in the United States with Black Lives Matter?
Yes. Okay. I don't know. What do you think, Maria? Yes.
I mean, that's what I would think, but I didn't. Yeah,
it was an echo of Black Matter, of Black Lives Matter. Yes.
Okay. And how did the indigenous population? How did that fit into it? Like, what was the? What were there dialogues about how indigenous people fit into it, etc., and so on? Sorry if I'm asking basic questions. I just want to understand and not jump to conclusions.
Yes.
How was that work? How was that worked out?
In the specific way, they did a very specific actions, symbolic actions of throwing down the how do you say, Ana Maria?
A statue. A statue.
Like you know, like what happened in the US and South Africa and in Europe. Yes. Okay.
Yes. And it's very interesting because they construct what is called minga, which means a work together.
Gathering.
But it's a minga with an intercultural minga. I mean, it's a solidarity between Black people and indigenous people and poor people, etc., etc. So that was the main, I think, the main interest with this process, which we have now, I think, with this our first vice president, Black female here in Colombia. So yes, that it's a kind of that. And I'm a little bit worried because looking at the experience of the United States with Obama presidency, etc., what we can also wait is a sort of reaction, backlash, etc., that could be, I don't know, in 10 years, etc. So I think that's very interesting because we cannot take for granted all the success we have, and we have always keeping out the fight. Yes, I think that's very, very, very important.
Okay. I would like to interrupt the conversation to raise the second question that we have planned for this conversation, which is what do you consider to be the priority and most interesting topics to be developed around racism in the US and in Colombia? From your both experiences, academic careers, what do you think are the things we should be talking about in regards to racism in both countries?
Well, I think we have maybe evoked some themes. I think that maybe affirmative action could be one of a topic of main interest now here in Colombia and also in the United States. Learning from the United States experience, and which is related with I have said about our vice president, because I think that, and I hope that it could be a topic, a main subject in the Colombian politics and public policy here in Colombia. So I think that could be very interesting. I don't know, another topic which could be related also with those Alexander presented, and it is related. I don't know, Alexander, if you know the work of Eduardo Bonilla Silva.
Yes.
Okay, because several years ago he presented a hypothesis about the Latino Americanization, I don't know if it's well said, of the United States. Because I don't know if the idea of color line in the United States could be understand like before. I think, as you said, talking about the idea of blackness and globally, I think that difference between American society and Latin American society, we are all worlds apart, etc. I don't think that it is that way. I think we have much more common than we can think. So I think that could be a very interesting point of exchange between the United States and Colombia in this project, or Latin America in this project. Those things.
Yeah, no, I think that would definitely be interesting, because I do think that there is still this idea of the kind of Latin Americanization of the US as like a Browning, whatever that that means. And I think so often a lot of these kind of ideas, they literally rest on the fact that they're imagining Latin America to not be Black. Right. So yeah, so I think, you know, a lot of, you know, the people that I've been in dialogue with have been working on Afro-Latinidad and even problematizing the idea of that, right? So I think, yeah, that there's definitely something there's definitely something there, right? And I think, you know, one can sort of honor the different histories in terms of race, but also think about the kind of commonalities, right? Because I think so often the response is, you know, and I'm gonna speak about the example that I know the best. Like in Germany, for instance, there's always this kind of line. It's like, oh no, we're not the United States, right? We don't have these problems. Things are different here. It's only bad in the United States, right? That's where racism happens. It doesn't happen there. And I mean, you know, it's like in France, it's the same thing, et cetera, and so on. But what I think, and this is also really comes out of my research on kind of global Black music, is that what I think is really different about the United States is that there's been a significant population of Black people that has kind of been living and creating culture in opposition to the mainstream for a very long time, right? If you look at, for instance, the articulation of a Black British community, it's something that's very recent. It goes back to the 1950s. Whereas in the United States, you go back to the 18th century, the 19th century, and also because of global capitalism, it's something that's been exported, right? And this is kind of going back to the beginning when I was talking about hip hop. What I was kind of trying to understand is like, why is it that, and how is it that Black American culture, particularly music, becomes this sort of focal point for different Black populations across the world, right? As a point of identification. Yeah, and I think one can do that without necessarily erasing the differences, right? The different the different contexts that exist here in this case between Colombia and the US. And also, the United States is really big, and like the racial histories are not the same. Chicago is one thing, New York is another thing, Los Angeles is another thing, Atlanta is another, Miami has a different history. There are clearly, links and commonalities, but it's very, very complicated, right? And the last thing that I'll say is this has also been one of the one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot in the last 10 years or so. I think that oftentimes when people, especially people outside of the United States, talk about Black culture in the United States, they do not realize how complex it is, right? So that, when I'm teaching my classes, I have a lot of Black students, but those Black students, if you break it down by ethnicity, their parents come from Senegal, their parents come from Jamaica, their parents come from Panama, et cetera, or, they're even born there. So I think that's another thing that I think has been really important for me to understand, is not to kind of flatten like Black culture in the United States, because it's really complex now. But even if you go back to 1920s Harlem, so many of the people, the major figures there, were from the Caribbean, right? They're from Trinidad, they were from Jamaica, et cetera, and so on. And I guess my sort of question or concern is, like, what kind of disservice are we doing by sort of flattening it, right, and making it out to be one homogeneous group, right? And I don't know, because I don't know. I should read up, I guess, on the Afro-Colombian populations. Are there different migration patterns from other places in Latin America or Central America, et cetera, and so on? What are those histories, and what are the kind of internal differentiation, right? And of course, also for me in my work, like gender and sexuality are also very important in terms of understanding the complexity and the internal differentiation as well. So.
Yes, that's it. We have also a very different populations here in Colombia. The Caribbean coast is very different from the Pacific coast, etc. And the people in the cities, yes, it's almost the same diversity. No sé. No tengo más que añadir.
Ok. Pues una última asunto que nos gustaría también que ambos se pronunciaran serían en algunos aspectos de colaboración que pudiesen proponer para el futuro, pues, digamos a mediano plazo, que lo vislumbren y que lo pudieran sugerir, digamos.
Okay, the
So
third
yes. So the last thing would be just adding some ideas or proposals of collaboration, cooperation in terms of research. So what ideas do you have for that, for doing research together? Just propositions. Yes, Oscar, you were gonna say something?
No, just think that this kind of activities, I think the first thing is to know each other, to exchange maybe our works, maybe our team research with I don't know, a kind of seminar or something like that, or Congress. I don't know, because and I know that Northwestern University has a very important history here, not only in the United States, but also here in Colombia, with the introduction of the study of Black people here in Colombia. So I think that there is also a history that we have to know, an intellectual, academic history that it could be very important to value, to know, right? And maybe after that, that kind of change, maybe knowing much more each other, we can arrive to maybe find several points of interest, common interest, etc. In order, why not, to write a project, something like that. I think that could be a proposal. Yes.
No, agreed. I should say I really know very little, again, because I'm not a social scientist, about writing these proposals, research groups and things like that. That's not, in the kind of, in my part of academia, that's not how things how things work. I know it a little bit actually from Germany, because so much of that's how the structure is set up there now, but here less so. Because I'm not a social scientist, but I think, yeah, like some further conversation would be amazing. Some kind of seminar where we exchange work and talk about it. And I think, yeah, that there were already a few moments of connection, crossover, right? Yeah, that I think that could be further elaborated. I should also say, this is my last week at Northwestern. I'm leaving here, actually. I'm starting a new job, but I don't think that should make a difference in the end. Yeah, so yeah, I'm going to Brown University on the east on the East Coast. So yeah, and yeah, that position starts next week. I don't start teaching until January, so I have a little bit of time to kind of gather my thoughts and breathe and do the move and everything. Yeah, but it's definitely exciting. So and one of the things that I'm really excited about is working with an art center. They have like a big new art center that has a lot of funding, which is nice. So yeah, so hopefully there could be something done through that as well, right? With the arts angle, but I don't know enough about it yet because I'm not on the ground there yet. But yeah, but I would definitely be interested. And is there, just so I have some basic understanding, is there a text in English that I can read that would sort of give me like a 101, like an introductory idea about the history of Blackness in Colombia?
Yes, the Peter Waite's, what's the name in English? I have it here in Spanish. It's
Okay.
Peter Waite. It's in
Wade's,
English.
Wade spelled how? W-A-D-E.
W-A-D-E. Yes.
Okay.
And I think the title is Blackness in Colombia, something like that.
Okay.
Yes.
And he wrote about music too. You mentioned him earlier as well, Óscar. Yeah.
Yes.
Is this the person defining Black? Yes, I have it here. So I'll look that up and I'll read that. Yeah, no, but I would definitely be interested in doing something together in the future. I've enjoyed these conversations, and I haven't, I think it's kind of been, I haven't really done any work on Latin America, not because I don't want to, but because you can't do everything. And I'm also, no, and I think it's sometimes I feel also like, as a Black academic, you're sometimes sort of made responsible for every Black group across the planet. And I'm just like, I don't have that training, right? And, and I would like to have some sort of like basic understanding about, history, structure, et cetera, and so on, before I do work in that. And, and I feel that about North America, the Caribbean, Europe, and certain parts of the African continent. But yeah, I would like to do more work on Blackness in Latin America. So yeah, so it would be interesting for me.
Vale, entonces pues yo creo que vamos cerrando.
Sí, está bien.
Beatriz, si quieres cerrar tú.
Yeah, thank you. And the book is called, in English, is called Blackness and Race Mixture.
Okay.
The dynamics of racial.
I have it here, Racial Identity in Colombia.
Yes, that one. Yeah, that book was his, I think it was his doctoral dissertation.
Okay, I'll look it up.
Mm-hmm.
And take it from there.
Okay, well, thank you, both of you, for this conversation. One of the things you mentioned, and it has been mentioned in the previous two conversations, is that we need to open spaces like this, more spaces like this for talking, for interacting, for getting to know each other. In the other conversation, when Carlos Biafara, Black academic, he was saying how lonely he felt in the study of racial issues in Colombia. And in the interview with Eduardo Bonilla Silva, he said the same. He said, as a Black academic, you usually, and because he's from Puerto Rico, he said that loneliness is sometimes is hard to bear with. So it's good for us to have this space, talking, for getting to know each other, to know each other's works. So that's one thing that's important here. The other one is that that you mentioned is we need to keep talking about the tensions between what Óscar said about defining or distinguishing ethnicity, race, culture, that here in Colombia, it's due to the national policy. It's like, oh, we love cultures and we are this pluri-ethnic country, but what's beyond that? In terms of race, I think we need to keep talking about those things. And a very important issue you raised was about the importance of not flattening the Black experience, not to think about it as a homogeneous something that every Black person lived the same thing. And that's important for us in this project to connect with the idea that, as Alexander, you said that we have to be able to grasp, to understand our Black students' different experiences. Like in the US, you said you have students from countries in Africa, from the Caribbean, and here in Colombia, we have Black students in the university who are very close to their cultural traditions. From the people in the Pacific towns, but some people whose history is more migration to the city, and they may experience more a social identity of Blackness, not necessarily a cultural identity of Blackness. So very interesting points you raised. We are going to take all of these ideas for the report, and based on that, and with the other conversations, with Rosa Emilia, we are going to organize what we can begin with. A seminar, an encounter will be a good idea for us to just interact and to know. And as with Rosa Emilia, Alex, we told you in the interview that we are going to work on the paperwork for inviting you next year to the Festival of Music, Petronio Alvarez, which is a festival, a festival of Black music, Black people. Yeah, so I think that's that, and I think you are going to enjoy that festival.
That sounds great.
It just happened 2 weeks ago. So, yes. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, everyone. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Thank you so much. It was an honor.
Gracias, Ana María, también. Y Candy también. Chao.